and let them know that we did that. So, and then on Thursday, we have a presentation kind of in the same vein, Special Education Finance Funding Day. Nick Myers, and I think also Frank is on that. He is a doctor of that subject, so we'll look forward to hearing from him. So that's the week. The action on the floor today, there was a little bit of concerns around our state school board pay equalization bill. I'm going to have some meetings. I'll keep the committee up to date, pulling some reports, and just looking at maybe just a couple little tweaks, and I will keep you up to date, but that's probably going to be Monday, that if we get to rework that, we'll rework it on Monday, okay? So just plan on, I'm next week, I haven't released it yet, but I'm kind of planning Monday through Wednesday of next week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday be our week, and we not meet Thursday and Friday. So that is that, and you should have your handout and PowerPoint presentation. We are going to take a look at the department's FTE report. So whoever wants to go first. Dr. Harwood, thanks for joining us.
Mr. Chair, member of the committee, thank you for giving us the opportunity. I know we had a lot of conversations about FTE. And just kind of for some perspective on this, so I was a superintendent for 12 years with $100 million budget and 1,000 employees, and I thought I understood budgeting and procurement and FTEs until I came to the state. And it's very different. And so that's why Dr. Hess is going to spend most of the time with that, because he deals with it more on a day-to-day basis on how each of those things work. But it is a little bit more complex than I think what people think about with it. So I think this is a really good opportunity for the committee to understand that, especially as every year with the budget bill, you're going to be hearing those things. So I think this is a good opportunity. I'm just going to start things a little bit with just the way we are organized. And so just the organizational chart for the department, we are governed by the State Board of Education, which we talked about, our 10 elected members from across the state. Dr. Watson is our commissioner. And then we're broken into 2 divisions. And then there are some other directors. So I'll talk about the directors. We have a director of HR that reports directly to the commissioner, general counsel. So just so everybody understands, there is general counsel for the state board, who is Mark Ferguson, and so he sits at the state board meetings. And then Scott Gordon is general counsel for the department. And so it's, for those of you who've ever been on boards, you know that the board has one attorney, and then in this case, because he does a lot with teacher licensure and investigations, he represents or advises the department. And then Denise Kaler is our director of communications. Most of you know Dr. Proctor, who, today we started interviews for his position. He's going back to Heston as a superintendent, so he will be leaving us at the end of June. But he's the deputy commissioner for the Division of Learning Services. There are 5 directors in learning services. It's broken into several different areas with SETS, which is special education and title services. Then Amanda Peterson with the director of early childhood. Shane Carter does teacher licensure. Beth Fultz is what's called CSAS, which is career standards and assessment services. That's it. Career standards and assessment services. And then Jay Scott is accreditation and design. And so that's where several of you have had conversations about KISA 2.0. That's where that resides, is in accreditation and design. And then I'm the deputy commissioner for fiscal and administrative services. I also have 5 directors. So John Hess is the director of fiscal services and operations. I can always get that wrong. Got that right. So John's job is all of the internal pieces, and then his staff also then sends out all of the payments. So he has a team of accountants that basically what they do is make sure that the right money goes to the right places. Kelly Cheney is our director of child nutrition and wellness. So her team mostly is federal funded. There's a little bit of SGF in there, but she is in charge of helping districts provide child nutrition programs and other partners. So not only are we with school districts, we also help with private schools, and then also child and adult programs that qualify under USDA. Ryan Kurtenbach is our Director of Information Technology. Just so you know, with that, our IT team has developed over 100 applications that we also manage. Most of that is around collecting information from districts, and then some other things. Laurel Murdy is our Director of Fiscal Auditing. She has a team of 19, and they go out and audit every district. And they're just different things throughout the year. Right now, we're doing the biggest audit, which is all of the student counts, which is the majority of the funding. And then Dale Brungart is the Director of School Finance. His team works with making sure that we're getting the information from districts that we need so that we can decide how much each district should get paid. And John's team sends it out to districts, and then Laurel's team makes sure that they got what they were supposed to have. So that's how all things work. So I just wanted to kind of point that out because one of the questions that's come up is just the way we set this up, and John will talk about this in a minute, is that we have a lot of what we classify as administrative staff. Now, if you think about school districts, you think about administrators or the principals and superintendents and assistant superintendents, that it's also all of the people that provide administrative support. So for us, auditors are administrative services because they are part of administering school finance. And so most of our role is actually the administration of school finance and then the administration of, on the other side, with learning services. So when you think about that, you think, oh, there's a lot of administrators. It's not a lot of people that have necessarily administrative titles like deputy commissioner, but it's a lot of people that have administrative functions. And so John will kind of go into that a little bit about how some of those FTE are divided up. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. John Hess, who will take over from here.
Thank you, committee. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, so I think we're getting the slides up or plugged in. One thing I'll note is starting with that, and I'll get into this a little bit here in a minute as I fail at technology. If it doesn't work, they have the slides so I can go through it bit by bit. So that's fine. That's all right. Okay. So I had hoped to put it up on the screen, but I believe you all have the handout, so we'll just go through it bit by bit in the old-fashioned paper version. So on the organizational chart, one thing I want to point out, so this is how KSD is structured for day-to-day operations. Budgetarily, it's similar, but not exactly the same. So some teams might be budgeted in multiple programs, and the reason why, I'll get to that in a little bit. It's just a structure, a function of how the state's accounting and budget systems work. So, for example, information technology is under Frank, and most of it is in the administration program. But those IT positions that are paid out of child nutrition and wellness funds, USDA funds for school nutrition programs, are budgeted under the child nutrition and wellness budget program. So I'll walk you through some examples in a little bit, but I just wanted to give you that little, there's a lot of overlap, but it's not exact. So, so the first question, I wanted to start at the basics with FTE and full-time equivalents. And so at the very basic on the next slide is what is included in KSD's FTE count. And so at the most basic level, the FTE count is the sum of KSD's permanent full-time and part-time positions, both classified and unclassified. At this point, KSDE only has one classified position remaining, but it's permanent, full-time, and part-time positions. So that is based on full-time is considered, so 1.0 FTE is considered 2,080 hours a fiscal year. So 40 hours a week times 52 weeks a year, so 2,080. If a position is 0.5 FTE, that means they're budgeted to work 1,040 hours. If they're 0.75 1,560 hours, and it'll vary all in between there. We have some part-time staff that are budgeted at 0.1, and then we have all the way up to 1. So that's kind of what we're looking at. It's based on the hours. It's also important to note this is tied to a position number. So it's not tied to the individual filling the position per se. In the state's HR system, you create a position and it gets a 9-digit position number, something around there. I'm going to say 9, and it's going to be 10 or 8 or something like that. But it gets a position number, and that's what this is all tied to, is to a specific position number. So one thing to note, though, about the FTE count is it does not include temporary positions. So if KSDE creates a temporary position, it is not included in the FTE count. You will still see the salaries and wages expenditures as a reported salaries and wages expenditure. It just will not be included in the FTE count. And so some examples of what we use those temporary positions for are some part-time temporary staff who help KSDE provide training to teachers in other parts of the field in, for example, standards alignment or assessments or something along those lines. We also put the elected state board members in temporary positions, so that way, since they're elected officials, they don't show up in our FTE count. So that's another example there. So then, on top of that, one thing that comes into looking at our FTE count is a concept called shrinkage. And so what this is this is going to be a lot of words, but it's the difference between the cost of fully funding KSDE salaries and wages from the state general fund for an entire fiscal year, assuming every position is filled for all 52 weeks, and KSDE's budgeted salaries and wages. So we have to do this because the budget assumes that there will be vacancies throughout the year. No KSDE will not fill every single SGF position for the entire year all the time. In addition, KSDE's SGF appropriation for agency operations wouldn't be big enough to cover all of our operating expenditures if all of those positions were filled. So if by some weird fluke of the universe, KSDE was able to fill every single SGF position for the entire year, we would run out of money before the end of the fiscal year. So our budget relies on shrinkage to work into balance. So for fiscal year 25, for example, the cost to fill all of KSDE's SGF positions would be a little over $12.8 million out of the SGF. But our budgeted salaries and wages are $11.8 million. So that's a shrinkage of $1,013,570 for the year, or 7.9%. So we're assuming that over the course of the year, 7.9% of positions, expenditures for salaries and wages will not occur. And we have to do that to make the budget math work. Because if not, we would, like I said, we would run out of money. And Mr. Chairman, if at any point, I'm happy to answer questions at any point along the way. So I just don't want to throw a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I wondered if there's not too many slides, but I had one just around, is temporary any more defined than what you've already shared as far as the temporary staff? I mean, is there a time limit on, can a temporary position be a 2-year position or a 6-month position, or like you said, part-time? How a little bit tighter definition?
Temporary positions there's a range for what they can be, and a lot of it depends on how a state agency wants to set them up in there. Like I mentioned, the position numbers associated for the state board are classified as temporary, but those position numbers have been the same position numbers for decades. So, but a lot of other temporary positions are positions for KSDE where people might come in and out, and we might not be constantly doing that type of work. And it's especially primarily when we hire teachers who might do additional work, like in the evenings or on the weekends, to help KSDE provide training to other teachers. So we try to hire in those positions kind of exceptional teachers in history or science or math or English language arts to help provide training in science of literacy or something like that.
I'm going to go with Representative Brantley and then come over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming today. I did have a question about the temporary staff. How many do you have?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would have to go back and double check. We have quite a few who work, those teachers who work just a couple hours a week, maybe at most. And when they are budgeted, their equivalent budgeting is 1/10 of an FTE. So it's not a significant amount of time because obviously they're not going to be able to, they can't work during the day. They're teaching for school districts or something like that. So we're talking about after hours type of stuff or weekends.
Okay. So a temporary staff person would only be the teachers that are like helping with trainings and such?
That is, Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, that's correct. That is predominantly how we use temporary staff.
Thank you.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you tell me a little more about classified and unclassified staff and help me understand what that means a little better?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so I'm not the exact expert on this. Classified staff under state law have certain additional protections for discipline, firing, that type of effect. There was a law, I believe, in about 2015 that said that all new positions have to be in the unclassified service, and also at the time, I think, provided some financial incentives to switch from the classified to the unclassified service. So anytime KSD creates a new position, it has to be unclassified, and we can't fill classified positions. So as staff who were in classified positions retired, we have eliminated those positions. If we wanted to replace that work, we had to delete the position number that was in the classified service and create a new one to replace it. So it ends up being a net zero, but that's what happened.
Sounds like a tenure bill that's running around the House a little bit. I'm just kidding. You can continue. I don't see any other. Oh, there you go. Representative Estes.
So you said that predominantly, which the opposite then would include that there is another smaller subset. Can you describe what that smaller subset of temporary employees are, please?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it's just the state board members, the positions that are associated with the state board members.
Thank you.
So for the next slide is then I wanted to, with that kind of background, I wanted to go over how KSDE creates positions. So there is an internal approval process that has been set out that requires the director of HR, the director of fiscal services, so the person occupying my position, the deputy commissioner of fiscal and administrative services, so Dr. Harwood's position, the deputy commissioner of learning services if it falls underneath the teams in his purview, and the commissioner of education all have to sign off on a form to create a position. So it has to go through an approval process before the position can be even created and posted to be hired. And then once somebody is hired, the State Board of Education has to, on its consent agenda, approve all personnel appointments. So it has, that includes the person filling it and their pay and effective when they're going to fill it. So the state board does that monthly. They have on their consent agenda a personnel report that they approve. One thing I will note is that as a separate constitutional entity, the State Board of Education has independent appointing authority. So what this means is that unlike most executive branch agencies, where the governor has to sign off on all new positions and the salaries associated with it, the State Board of Education does not have to go through that process. So the State Board can create positions on its own within SMART and set the pay for that and everything associated with it. And so this is very similar to how the Attorney General's office, the Secretary of State, or the Insurance Commissioner work. They are independent appointing authorities for their departments. The same thing is for the State Board in relation to the State Department of Education. And so related to that, I would note is a decade or so ago, there used to be FTE caps in the budget bills. And so those were eliminated at some point in time. But even when those did exist, KSDE did not have one in those budget bills because it was the state board is an independent appointing authority. So whenever KSDE creates new positions, it can do so, when it gets a new federal grant, it can do so because the state board has that separate constitutional authority to create those positions.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You maybe need to walk me through that again, because I think what you said when you did, there's a need for a position in a department, the deputy commissioners and the commissioner get together and create that position, and then when you have a candidate to fill the position, you go to the state board. That sounds a lot like the department's creating the position and then asking for state board approval versus the state board having constitutional authority to make that position.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so the state board has, as part of its management of hiring the commissioner, the commissioner runs the State Department on behalf of the State Board of Education. So that's part of what the commissioner is hired to do. Position, this is the process that is also used when filling existing positions, I would emphasize as well. So it's not just to create new positions. We use the same process that so for example, since Dr. Harwood mentioned it, Dr. Proctor is heading back to be a superintendent. We went through the same process to go through and post that position, get the same approvals to fill that position. And so that is how it is set up within the state's HR system as well. So I would have to go and double check the inner workings of that, but that is how the system currently operates.
Yeah, I had a little bit of a pre-read of this before committee, and I thought the exact same thing. There's 7 steps, and it's basically the very last one is, once the form is fully approved and someone is hired for the position, the state board must confirm the appointment of that individual to the position. But I see what you're saying from the perspective of they have hired or given authority for this process to the commissioner and everybody else involved, and then they are confirming it. So
I would, Mr. Chairman, I would say that, yes, I would look at it that way. Also that this is similar to kind of how when KSDE contracts for some services, there's a threshold at which it, under state board policy, it needs to come to the state board. In other ones where it's been delegated to the commissioner to approve without state board authority. That threshold is $10,000. So if we're contracting for a service that is $8,000, the state board has determined that the commissioner can execute that contract without having to come to the state board.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may be an interesting question, but you're mentioning Dr. Proctor and that you are creating these positions. So I have 2 questions. One, this is similar to how superintendents do it in the school district and then the school board. Would that be a fair assessment? Okay. So when you were looking at Dr. Proctor's position, the Department of Administration has specific hiring processes. Are those the processes that you use?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes. We follow the Department of Administration's hiring processes. It's just that the state board and the department can create new positions without having to go through the governor's office.
So are you following their current recruitment and hiring guides?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I don't oversee the hiring process. The director of HR does. As far as I know, we are following the current processes.
So that would be going against a federal mandate, and that's concerning because it talks about DEI. And we have a federal mandate not to be doing that. It's right here. So we're following those processes.
We follow state law. As I do not know in terms of of those exact processes. We are always strive to be in compliance with both state and federal rules and regulations on that. I would have to talk to the Director of Human Resources about how that relates to what we are doing. Because that gets a little bit further into the weeds of the hiring and recruitment process than I'm familiar with.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just concerning because if that's what they're doing, we do have a directive to make sure that we're not hiring based on DEI in public schools receiving federal funding.
Mr. Chairman, if I may. I do know that the State Department's goal is to always hire the most qualified person for a position. I will say that.
Representative Estes.
Okay, I have two lines of questioning. The first one, I want to go back to the temporary employees. And you said that it's predominantly teachers, but then the rest are school board members. They get benefits, they get insurance and capers and so on. I don't know. That was a question mark in my tone.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, they are eligible to make those selections if they so choose. They are not, it's under the same kind of laws governing the legislature in terms of choosing to enter capers or if they want health insurance along those lines. I think only a handful of the board members currently have health insurance, I believe, through the state, and I don't know if any of them are currently active in capers.
Okay. It just seems to me that it may be a revolving position, but it's not a temporary position, and we attach benefits to it. Just kind of something I'm thinking about. But I'd really like to go back to your conversation with Representative Hill, that your answer seemed to be that, yes, the state board has the power to create positions, but it's kind of delegated to the commissioner. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, it is.
Okay. But for clarity in my own mind, is the state board can say anything to they run the commissioner, and they could say to commissioner, we want these positions created, and they have that right to do so at any time?
Mr. Chairman, if the state board, for example, if the state board did not approve an appointment of somebody to a position, that person could not fill that position.
Not what I'm asking. If the state board said, we need a new hole punch procurement person, that we need somebody, I'm just trying to obviously pick a non-policy related position, but if they said we need a person for X position, their directive with a vote to the commissioner should mean that should happen, correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it would if the state board directed the commissioner to create a specific position, the department would have to abide by the vote of the board.
Okay, so then if, and how many people do you currently have on staff who review what goes on the at-risk list?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to go back and double check exactly. There's a variety of people who are involved in the process. I know there is at least one specific person whose job is predominantly that, but it involves several other people. It's not just that one person.
And are temporary employees ever used in that process?
Mr. Chairman, not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, and is a separate person with an expertise in reading the person who looks at what qualifies for the reading-related at-risk things, and a separate person who's a subject matter expert in mathematics who picks those things, or does one person pick both? Do you know?
Mr. Chairman, we have a series of program managers who are experts in specific fields and subject matters that are involved in, well, Frank seems to be wanting to, but those people are also involved in that process, but Frank will have a better idea of what's involved.
So specifically for the at-risk list, the criteria for being on the at-risk list is to have peer review that it would be there. So the person that would do that could certainly talk to one of the program specialists in whatever area that is, but that person has the expertise to know if something has peer review evidence or not. The list that we put together is not an endorsement of anything on the list. It's whether or not it meets the criteria that the legislature put forth in order to be eligible to be on the list.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Representative, oh, you were next. Sorry, Representative Smoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does it follow the same general pattern if we were to eliminate an FTE? And how often are FTEs reviewed and eliminated by the agency?
Mr. Chairman, the decision to eliminate vacant FTEs is a little bit more informal, and it is done primarily it is done in consultation between myself, the director of HR, and the pertinent director whose team that position is on. So if a position has been vacant for a significant period of time and there's no plan to fill it, we will go through as part of the budget process in the summer, usually at the end of June or beginning of July, and go through and deactivate or delete vacant FTEs.
All right. Thank you very much.
But you're, in a sense, keeping some for the shrinkage purposes?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, yes, sometimes we do, and it's a give and take about where we are, and most state agencies do keep positions open to absorb shrinkage. So that it's a common practice among state agencies.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. I have a question regarding FTEs, and it's been kind of a hot topic lately. How many of your FTEs are actually working on location, or how many are working at home?
Mr. Chairman, so the significant majority of our permanent full-time FTEs are based in Land and State Office Building. The agency's remote work policy for those staff is that they can remote work 1 day a week with approval of their supervisor. Otherwise, they have to be in the office. KSDE does have a series of field-based staff, however, whose work location is assigned as their home. They work from home or they're traveling about. And so examples of those are the fiscal auditors are stationed throughout the state. And that does save the agency a significant amount of money on travel costs instead of having to send everybody out from Topeka out to Hayes or Colby or something like that. We have auditors in Northwest Kansas, Southwest Kansas, stuff like that, who audit the school districts in those areas.
Thank you. So on the 1 day a week that they don't have to be in the office, are you still paying them for that day?
Mr. Chairman, that is a policy that allows them to work remotely from home. It is often associated with having to perform specific tasks. So they need a day away from the office to finish writing a grant proposal, so they're not getting interrupted, that type of thing.
So all FTEs have option of having 1 day to work at home?
Mr. Chairman, that is, it is subject to the approval of the team's director. So I can tell you, for example, my staff, I have not allowed that because our work processes do not allow efficient work from home. We kind of have, it's 2025, we're still paper-based significantly for processing vouchers and payments and things like that. And so we need to be in the office to have access to that, and it hasn't been digitized because, so it's subject to the director's discretion. And I know other directors have not allowed it either.
Thank you.
Good questions, everyone. Well, I'll let you get back to your presentation. Thanks for letting it. Yes, absolutely. Representative Estes.
It's an interesting line of conversation with that set of questions, because I can see, yes, it makes sense that your people need to be in. There may be times that you just want to work with people and allow them to work from home, but when someone does work from home, does KSDE do anything that some other companies do to make sure that computers are being logged in and work is actually happening, or is it an honor system?
Mr. Chairman, directors or immediate supervisors are expected to check in with staff and make sure they are working. Every agency computer has Microsoft Teams attached to it, which has, the active icon on it, and it's the responsibility for, especially if they're supposed to produce a specific thing or application. Some of our application developers might be at home to code uninterrupted for a day. Like, we will know if that, like, they're supposed to get coding of this app done this day. We will know whether or not that was done.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll let you continue. Thanks for letting us ask questions.
Happy to do so, Mr. Chairman. So then how does KSDE fund positions? So funding is based on the work that is included in the position description and what funds can legally be used to support that work. So, for example, we have the teacher licensure fee fund under state law. We collect fees from teachers for paying their licenses. That money can then be used to support the teacher licensure team. It can't be used to pay my salary or a portion of my salary. So or another example is we get a grant from the federal government for administration associated with implementation of the IDEA, special education law. Federal or state law includes gifted students in special education. Federal law does not. So therefore, we cannot use the federal IDEA grant to support any kind of gifted programming in the state of Kansas. We have to use state general fund monies for that. And so that is part of knowing what funds can and cannot be used for is part of how we describe or we decide to fund positions. So once we do that, KSDE maintains a separate internal accounting system that we reconcile to SMART, which is the state's accounting system. So within that KSDE internal accounting system, we create funding codes that are tied to specific funding sources, the teams they're associated with, and budget programs. So for example, on this slide, you see one H00130. That is the SGF funding code used for my fiscal services and operations, the team that I oversee, and it is budgeted within the administration program. R00200 is an SGF funding code for child nutrition and wellness that is budgeted in the child nutrition and wellness program. So we use these funding codes to create budgets and help individual teams track their expenditures throughout the course of the fiscal year. So funding codes are then assigned to position based on the work in the position's description and the amount of time they're working on that task. So somebody working on federal special education might be only 25% of their time. So their budget, that's how they are budgeted. They're only supposed to use it for part of the time. Some positions have one funding code, especially positions like kind of agency overhead positions that are paid out of the state general fund typically have one funding code because that provides flexibility. They can work for everybody in the agency. Others may have 4 or more. There are a couple positions, especially funded by federal grants, that have 6 funding codes. So they're paid out of 6 different funding sources. And then it's those assigned funding codes determine in which budget program a position is budgeted because there is a code attached to the position, and when it gets loaded into the state's budgeting system, it's that code that determines where it shows up in the budget. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples. There is some in the memo, but I think seeing it visually on the slides might be helpful. So let's start from left to right. So the first position I wanted to give you is the Commissioner of Education. That position is funded completely out of the state general fund. That funding code, the first one in the top left is out of the state general fund, and it is budgeted in the administration program. So the Commissioner of Education shows up as a 1.0 FTE in the admin program with all of the associated salaries and wages coming out of the state general fund. There is a communications specialist within communications and recognition programs within KSDE that is funded 75% out of the state general fund, but 25% is funded by the administrative grant from USDA for child nutrition programs. So that is the green and the gold color. So the green color is or teal, I guess, 75% SGF. They show up as 0.75 in the administration program. And then that gold color is budgeted, and it comes out of, it shows up in the CNW program. So then they are a 0.25 FTE in the CNW program. So the funding for that position, they're a 1.0 FTE, but it gets split across budgetary programs. An application developer here with 3 different funding codes. So 25% for that CNW USDA funding code, 50% for generic SGF for IT, shows up in the admin program, and then they have a funding code also for the IDEA administrative grant that is created underneath that team, so it shows up in admin, even though it's funded by a federal grant. So in that case, they would be 0.25% or 0.25 FTE in CNW, 0.75 FTE in the administration program, with the expenditures 50% out of federal funds and 50% out of the SGF. And then finally, a SETS assistant director. They have 3 different funding codes. So one would be the IDEA admin portion that is budgeted for special education services. So that shows up in that program 40% of the time. Then they also have 40% of their time is for title programs. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so Title I, Title II, Title III, those types of programs. 40% of them, their time is then budgeted in the title programs and services, or the title program services budget, or budget program. And the final little bit is 20% SGF from special education. And so that shows up in the special education program. So that position would be 0.6 in the special education program and 0.4 in the title program. So I just, the funding codes are associated to teams, but then what budget program they show up in is different. So that's just a quirk of how the state's budgeting system works. And I threw a bunch of stuff at you, so I assume there will be questions, so I'm happy to stop.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Dr. Hess. It's got to get a little bit confusing sometimes, doesn't it? Do you have a total number of FTEs with all those different percentages and shared responsibilities? Do you have a total number of FTEs that are dedicated to federal programs?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to go and double check that. I thought that question might get asked, and I tried to have time to do it today, and I had a bunch of other stuff I was doing, so I'm happy to get that for it. But there's a significant amount of staff that have federal funding.
Could you give me kind of a range idea?
Probably at least half of the FTEs in the agency have some kind of federal funding on them.
Okay, and Mr. Chair, yeah, one thing that is kind of in the back of my mind. You talked about programs get canceled or changed or whatever, and the people are tied to that program. What do you? I mean, is that they get fired, or how does that work?
Mr. Chairman, if for example we get a grant, a time-limited grant for 3 years. They are hired to work on that grant. Sometimes you might have turnover elsewhere, and so if the director for that team wants to keep them on after the grant expires, they may have had turnover somewhere else, and so they can shift them from one position working on this new grant to working on something else that the agency was already doing. If that doesn't exist, once the grant funding ends, the position has to end.
So like a specific example of when we had Safe and Secure Schools vetoed last year. What happened?
Mr. Chairman, those positions, when they were added in, I think back in 2018, they were doing other work besides that grant. So they were also they are providing training to school districts on how to improve their safety, including one of the things they do is they walk around, they go visit schools, and they do surveys of schools and produce reports for those principals or other administrators about how they can improve the safety at their schools. So those jobs were not solely tied to the school safety grant. They are doing other things as well.
So they're not normally paid out of the school safety grant?
Mr. Chairman, no, they were, when there was additional funding added by the, I believe, 2018 legislature into KSD's operating budget to pay for those two positions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. When I look at this and I look at the application developer, by that, do you mean an app you would use on a smart device?
Mr. Chairman, not per se, in terms of our web-based applications. So KSD has over 100+ web-based applications that are used to report data. It's how school districts request their federal money on a monthly basis for their grants and things like that. So there's just.
That's why we have the unusual mixture.
Yes.
I was trying to determine where we got that combination of sources from. That's helpful. Thank you.
Anybody else? Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe for the committees and my refreshment, what did the budget bill this year do to shrinkage and vacant FTEs?
Mr. Chairman, right now, as it passed the House, it's the shrinkage rate and the FTE count is what was in KSDE's submitted budget. So it's 270.9 total FTEs, and the shrinkage rate is the same as of right now. That is pending. I believe 2007 had the 1.5% across the board reduction in operating expenditures. If that becomes law, KSD will have to figure out how to implement that. We'll have to decide where to take that money from.
Okay. I thought they clawed back FTEs that were non-vacant, that were vacant.
Mr. Chairman, that was an original recommendation, but this committee put in some. Oh, the vacant. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, Representative. Sorry, that is pending as of July 1, 2025. KSDE hasn't. I mean, those positions are not. I mean, KSDE's just waiting to see what happens with that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Jennifer, was there anything that you wanted to add to that? I wanted to give you space if you wanted to.
Mr. Chair, I think that Dr. Hess did a great job. The two that I was going to reference were just the two globals across the entirety of the budget, which is the 1.5% in SGF expenditures and operating expenditures, and then the vacant FTEs as of the beginning of fiscal year 2026 would disappear as well. So those are the two globals that are in the budget that would, I believe, the representative was referring to.
Representative Estes.
Then, kind of as a follow-up, going back to your the early slide where you talked about the planned shrinkage, do we have years where we have more shrinkage than we planned for and there is money left over?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'll just say no. KSD has not reappropriated money in its operating account since I've been there and since I've been involved with the budget, which was going back to 2017. And as far as I know, I have not found a record of KSD reappropriating unspent operating money.
So not exactly what I'm asking. But I'm asking, are there years that we have experienced greater shrinkage than what we planned for?
Mr. Chairman, I I would have to go back and do the actual math on some things. There probably were at some point where we had it, but then it was offset by additional expenditures somewhere. So it turned out to be good that we had higher shrinkage than anticipated.
Okay. And is the reverse also true? Are there years where we had less shrinkage than we expected? And how does KSDE handle that financial impact?
Mr. Chairman, that does happen on occasion. If that happens, what our tendency to do is to find expenditures that can be the funding source that may have originally been paid out of the state general fund. There might be another legal funding source for it, and so we do a journal voucher to change the funding source for it, to shift it from SGF to another source that can be legally paid for, to help free up SGF money to pay salaries and wages.
But all of that is always subject to the federal rules for the federal programs.
Of course,
Okay.
yes. It's always within complying with federal rules for those funds.
Okay. So in the years where we have greater shrinkage than we expected, you said money can get moved around, and I think that was a question asked by one of our members at one point, and so I'm a little confused about the answer because I thought things had to stay in their line item, but you have greater authority to move things around than I think I expected.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, the state's accounting system does not force, or budget system does not force agencies to stay within the budgeted amounts for specific account code objects of expenditure. So that is how we budget something, but sometimes we have to, a contract might come in more expensive than we initially anticipated because of something for that fiscal year, and so we need the flexibility to move funds that may have otherwise been budgeted for salaries and wages into that contract.
Okay, thank you. Very enlightening.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for being here today. Did you mention earlier that half of your FTEs are from federally funded?
Mr. Chairman, that was my rough best guess as of now. It might even be a little bit more because from a dollar perspective, I think federal funds, I would say non-SGF funds are more than 50% of our salaries and wages, but some of that includes the licensure fee fund, for example. So about 50% from federal funds seems reasonable looking.
So, and this may be, Dr. Harwood, how much does KSDE receive from the federal funds grants for the FTEs?
I can get you that answer in a few minutes. I have to pull up a spreadsheet, though, to do it. So I'm happy to do so.
All right, thank you.
Last one, Representative Steele, and then we'll let him finish more of his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a formula for how you decide, for example, the communication specialist, that this is going to be 75% and this is going to be 25%? What makes that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it's based on the amount of time they're working on those different projects. So if 25% of their 2,080 hours over the course of a year is working for the Child Nutrition and Wellness Program, that's where that 25% comes from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, great job. Let's get him maybe a couple more pages and we'll see if we can get us out of here by 5.
Mr. Chairman, I am trying to find the federal information real quick, but I have a very large spreadsheet that's okay. Mr. Chairman, so for federal funds for fiscal year 25 for salaries and wages, it's budgeted at $10.6 million right now. So might actually be, and we have 11 some million from SGF, so it's probably a little less than half of the FTE positions are funded or have federal funding codes.
What was the total number?
10.6 from federal funds for salaries and wages in fiscal year 2025.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, so then how does KSD like to manage its FTE position? So whenever possible, KSD does try to repurpose vacant FTE positions, especially if it's within a specific team like information technology or child nutrition and wellness. We will try to repurpose those positions. But that is not always, sometimes that is not possible or an efficient use of agency staff time. So in particular, possible, because most federal grants have what are called supplement, not supplant provisions in them. And so what that means is the federal funding has to be used to supplement existing state resources for a specific program. It cannot be used to replace state resources. So if we have a vacant position that is budgeted out of existing state resources that's vacant, we cannot repurpose that position for a new federal grant that's working on something very similar without running afoul of the supplement, not supplant provision. So in that case, we have to create a new position for that grant. It might also not necessarily be efficient, so we might create a position for a year or so in school accreditation because the state board approved a new initiative and we need to shift resources from a vacant IT position over to there instead, but with the intention that that's going to be a short-term initiative and then we're going to want to fill that IT position later anyway, so it would not make much sense to delete that IT position if we're just going to have to recreate it in a little bit. So it's not, we're trying to also be efficient with the use of agency staff time when doing that. And then, as indicated earlier, KSDE and every state agency that I know of, funded by the state SGF, will often leave positions vacant purposely vacant to absorb shrinkage. So that way, we can make sure that we have enough resources available for other important operating expenditures, like the state assessment contract from KU, rent for the building, all of that, travel expenditures for the auditing staff, that type of thing. So that's kind of the general, how we generally approach that. And as I indicated earlier, each summer we do go through and review what vacant positions are there and whether or not they need to stay on the books and if we can delete them or not. So ever since I've been there, we always delete at least a couple of positions every single summer. So then the last little bit is I wanted to give some history of KSDE's FTE count. So this first chart is the total FTE count for KSDE going all the way back to fiscal year 2010. So as you can see, the high point was in fiscal year 2011 with 295.3 FTE positions. And then there was a decline from there until 2016, where and then it went back up after that. Part of that is the Children's Cabinet used to be under DCF and then came over to KSDE, so that was an increase in the FTE count. In fiscal year 2022, we had some new positions, for example, for administering pandemic relief funds. And then there was also on page 4 of the written testimony, over the course of fiscal year 18, 19, and 20, the legislature added a handful of positions. So 2 FTE in fiscal year 18 to implement the school finance law, 2 in fiscal year 2019 for those to improve school safety and security, and then 1 in fiscal year 2020 to administer accountability provisions associated with Senate Bill 16 from that point, so which was passed in the 2019 legislature. And then the final slide I have is KSD's FTE positions by program from 16 to 25. So this just takes the table that is on page 5 of the written testimony and puts it in graph form. Might be a little bit easier, I say easier, those lines are still kind of close together at the bottom, to see where they go. Sometimes you might see a decrease in one program and an increase in the other, and that's because we shifted how positions were funded. And that might account sometimes for the going back and forth between different programs. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to answer any other questions.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Hess, it stands out to me that the first 3 years that you've got here, 16, 17, 18, we had 23 people involved, FTEs, I should say, FTEs involved with assessments. That number went up a little bit, and then in 23, it went up 4 positions. I assume there's a logical explanation for that.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is the result of an internal agency reorganization. So there was the Kansas Volunteer Commission, which is an entity within KSDE, was previously budgeted under the administration program. And so at that point, there was a decision to reorganize because it thought it would better align with the Standards and Assessment Services program. And so those staff were moved up, were rebudgeted in that program. So that accounts for that increase.
And they came out of where, again?
The administration program.
Okay, so we should be able to see a corresponding decline, which we essentially, there's actually a pretty good decline in 23 on administration there.
And Mr. Chairman, that is the year where I deleted the most vacant positions, was in the summer of 2022, which was right before we did the revised 2023 number. So in the summer of 2022, that's when a lot of that happened.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions, committee? Representative Bowsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you said the Children's Cabinet moved from DCF to KSDE when?
In beginning July 1, 2016, so in fiscal year 2017.
Okay, so I was noticing the first few years on that chart of the history of KSDE, FTE positions dropping from 295 down to almost 245 from FY11 to FY16. Is there any explanation for that? Seems substantial.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything exactly. I think part of it may have been associated with some of the state budget difficulties at the time, but I was not here at the time. I was still studying in grad school, so I couldn't tell you for sure. And my predecessors are very retired and won't answer my phone calls. So,
And I could have made that assumption on my own, and I hesitated to ask you, but I appreciate the response.
I would also add there is probably, if I had to guess, there's probably also a reduction of federally funded positions as well. And maybe we had positions on the books that hadn't been vacant for a while. And so over the course of a couple years, they just, whatever the funding source, we're not going to fill these anymore, so we don't need to have them on the books.
Well, I hope when the one classified position retires that there's a good celebration retirement party for that individual. Thank you.
That was a question when we were talking about classified and non-classified. How many classified positions are there in the department?
Mr. Chairman, we have one that is filled. We have one that we keep to absorb shrinkage, and that's it. So we can't fill a vacant classified position, and we have one that is filled. And so when that person retires, if we want to replace that rehire for that work, we'll have to delete the classified one and recreate and create an unclassified equivalent.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to definitely ask, and you kind of alluded to it, so. Representative Estes.
Thank you. I appreciated the graph on one level because it gives me context, but I am missing some. I'd love whole numbers moving forward because then I'm not having to guess, was that where between 290 and 300 that is? I'm not a good.
I didn't want to overwhelm with numbers, but we can certainly provide that. I have it. I took that out of a spreadsheet that I already have, so we can provide that.
Thank you. The same for the next one. And this is not a question for you. It's more of a statement, so please don't feel obligated to respond. I guess it distresses me when I hear, well, we keep certain positions because we're afraid these other things might happen. And I get where the department is coming from on that, but then I think it kind of makes, when you come to the appropriations process and there's been a request for new employees, I think that's part of why sometimes there is kind of pushback. And some of the things that you said, well, they cost more. I probably feel like we could do a better job of serving you guys if you guys gave us actual real numbers of it. And some of it, commodities are going up. Some of it's hard and you're not always able to fully do that well, but more of this is what this cost us, so you don't feel like you need to say, well, we want to keep this employee on the book to give us a way to compensate when something's not what we budgeted for. That's just my perspective.
Mr. Chairman, I would just point out that, I mean, when the agency comes with a request for additional funding or positions for administrative work, I mean, that request is being made because we do not have the financial resources to fill those positions. So there's rising costs elsewhere. Our rent goes up every year, but we don't get additional money from the legislature to pay the rent. And so it might not seem like much, but I mean, that's about $90,000 this year that I have to find to pay the rent that we didn't get extra money for. So that's an additional extra position there with fringes and things like that. So, I mean, when we're requesting additional funding, I mean, we do not have the money to be able to fill those positions. And so sometimes as when the $184,500 that you put in, and we found some positions that we can repurpose for that, and as long as we have the money, we can fill those existing positions. But I mean, we can't fill all of our SGF positions with our current appropriation and the way costs elsewhere are moving.
Did you guys ask for more rent this year? I don't remember.
Mr. Chairman, no, we do not ask for rent.
Then that's part of what I'm saying. Be upfront with us on what you need and why specifically, so then we get a better level of confidence with each other over time.
And Mr. Chairman, we were trying to our budget testimony was trying to address that. I believe the section where we talked about that enhancement request for 6 FTEs did talk about some of the rising overhead costs that we have to absorb without an additional appropriation. I know at some point back when I was at KLRD, there was KSD did request funding for the monumental building surcharge, which is that portion that pays for the upkeep of the State House, and that didn't really go anywhere. So we don't, in part because understandably, if the legislature appropriates it for one agency, they have to appropriate it for everybody. And so, but we have tried to be, my goal is to always be forthright about the other overhead costs that are driving and putting constraints on KSD's operating budget.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we had a somewhat of an understanding, just speaking to what we were just asking of, that FTEs create kind of this buffer zone. And a lot of times what we're talking about isn't just the position and what it's going to do. It's all the other things that are going on somewhat around it, or at least in the same ballpark. But it is a good way to think. It's a whole lot easier to be clear, but this building isn't always clear, and that's not all your fault or my fault. There's a collective effort, but more clarity could create better decision making. And I do think that's kind of what we're getting at, and what we maybe would like more of, and we'll try and give it as well as receive it.
And Mr. Chairman, that's when I put together KSD's budget every summer. That's my goal when we put together. Granted, it'll put you to sleep, but I mean, it's a 450-page document, and I try to be very clear each summer about which new FTE positions we created and what work for what purpose, and which ones we deleted and what were they doing. So I mean, that is something I try to do every single summer to make that information available to, I don't know, the 5 people who probably actually look at it, but it is there. I do try to make it available.
Appreciate it. Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On your testimony, the last page, or page 5 of it, so the COVID-19 transactions, are those 4.4 FTEs listed there for federal funding?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, those are funded 100% out of federal pandemic relief funds.
So next year, that should be a 0.
Mr. Chairman, it will, in fiscal year 26, it will continue to be there, in part because we have authority from the federal government to liquidate those funds through fiscal year 26, but fiscal year 27 is when they would go away, because that's when that funding will go away.
Do you have any other positions that are listed on this that are funding under those ESSER 3 funds and the ARPA funds?
Mr. Chairman, no. The Department of Administration requires us to use that specific program code for those ESSER funds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm kind of a org chart fan. I guess one of my requests, whether it's next year or as we go forward, like even on Office of the Commissioner, an org chart around that we could see. I think there's one there, but they're neat to look at. You kind of get the web of involvement and the complexity and the simplicity all in the same picture. And then same way with Division of Learning Services, Division of Fiscal. Even just those 3, instead of it all being in one, but they being broke out in 3, I think it would paint a good picture for the conversation that we're having of understanding the FTEs. A picture could be very helpful. So I just make that request if it's available. I'd love to see it and share it with the committee. With that, Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for being here today. So as we're talking about the FTEs, so KSDE receives about half, maybe your funding for your FTEs from federal, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I think a little under, maybe 40%, something like that, because we also have other state funds as well that fund those. But yeah, a significant chunk.
So to make sure that those funds continue, and this isn't directed at you, but I would recommend that you look at a quick online resource to be able to detect if there's DEI on your website and remove that so we don't lose any of the federal funding for those positions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hess. Thank you, Frank, or Dr. Harwood, sorry. Tomorrow we'll jump into, is it the 50-state comparison tomorrow? And so we'll see you back here tomorrow. Thank you, committee, for great questions and a great conversation. We are